Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I am bringing you some winter reading recommendations. We're in a slightly different setup today. You can see Sophia oh so glamorously grooming herself behind me. I'm at my parents' house for the remainder of lockdown and through Christmas, so you'll get used to the setup unless I can find somewhere else that's a little better to film, but the lighting's not great in here. I've got some cats doing some interesting stuff behind me, so just bear with me. But basically I wanted to do a list sort of similar to my fall reading recommendations, which was pretty much strictly spooky books, and give you some recommendations for the winter time, where I feel fall is sort of spooky season, very firmly spooky season. That's kind of the sort of thing that people think of to read in the fall. I feel like winter is just the season of possibilities in terms of reading. It's the perfect time to read historical fiction. It's the perfect time to read crime novels. It's the perfect time to pick up some epic fantasy series. And you can also get some really, really amazing atmospheric books. So I had originally thought that I might do this video as two videos and do like atmospheric wintry reads versus like historical crime novels with some sort of supernatural elements, which I feel fit in really nicely with this season. But I did a poll on Twitter and you guys said do one long video, so that's what we're gonna do today. I'll try to kind of like clump these together and theme them a little bit so it makes a little bit of sense, but these are, I believe, 10 books that I would highly recommend you add to your winter TBR. So first I thought I would start with some wintry atmospheric books. These are all books that kind of have some kind of either Christmassy connection, some kind of December connection, or take place in a sort of wintry landscape. I feel like these are really, really perfect to read as the nights get a little bit longer, things get a little bit colder, and hopefully if you're lucky you get some snow. I would be very jealous if you got snow because I never ever get snow. So the very first recommendation that I have for atmospheric winter reads is obviously the Winter Night Trilogy by Katherine Arden. This starts with The Bear and the Nightingale. This is a fabulous trilogy. You have probably heard of it if you have been on BookTube for a while. You have probably seen me talk about it because I absolutely adore this series like many others do. So one of the reasons that it's perfect for winter reading, although the clue is kind of in the title, is that it takes place kind of during winter time in sort of a snowy landscape. So the kind of winter as a season and also kind of as a anthropomorphized being is a part of this book, and it's so perfect for cold nights. So basically we follow a girl named Vazia throughout this series, and she is a young girl growing up in medieval Russia, and it very much draws from historical influences. At this particular time, Christianity is sweeping through Russia, and the old ways are beginning to be forgotten. The creatures of folklore that depend upon people's beliefs are starting to fade. Now, Vazia is one of the very rare people who can actually see these creatures, who can kind of communicate with them. So she's very much in touch with the old ways. However, a Catholic priest comes to town and begins to convert people and is hyper-focused on Vazia. So that's kind of the first book, and it goes through her growing up and kind of gaining her independence and her sense of self, and these books are just amazing. They're really good crossover books if you're someone who has read a lot of YA but wants to maybe step into adult fantasy, and they're also amazing if you are strictly an adult reader, also if you're a historical fiction reader, because it does again draw a lot on the history of Russia at the time. These books are beautiful, they're absolutely stunning, and the series is complete, so you can totally binge it this winter. The next book that I would recommend for an excellent atmospheric winter read is actually a novella. This is The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. This is a historical set ghost story, and it is fabulous. It takes place at Christmas time, so Christmas is definitely a theme in this book if you're looking for some stuff that actually focuses on the holiday, and it is really good. So I was initially introduced to this via the stage play, which is fantastic. I've seen it a couple of times. It scared the absolute crap crap out of me. I am a huge wimp. And I was very curious to read the actual source material. I believe this came out in the 80s, so it's been around for a while, and I think it's still pretty highly regarded as a great ghost story. So basically we have this young man kind of telling the story of this event that happened in his life. He was kind of an up-and-coming solicitor, and he is assigned the case of getting the affairs of this elderly, kind of reclusive woman in order so that they can sell her house after she's died and everything like that. So he goes to the remote village where she lives and where her house is, and he notices that the people there are very skittish when it comes to this house and when it comes to this deceased woman. And so he's kind of, you know, thinks it's strange, but he goes ahead and he stays at the house by himself, and some very, very horrifying things happen. I love historical set ghost stories. If you have watched my channel recently, I have a few videos about them and kind of supernatural stories, and also if you continue on with this video, you will see more of them. And this book is just so perfect. It fits the bill absolutely perfectly. It's a really, really quick and very compulsive read, and it's a great ghost story. Next is a book that I haven't seen talked about much on BookTube, but has gained some pretty serious acclaim in the kind of like literature world in general. This is Pine by Francine Toon. This is a contemporary set story. It takes place in rural Scotland, and it is a very quiet book. But it's really fabulous. The author was apparently a poet. This is her debut novel, and you can really, really tell that she wrote poetry before, because I think it's beautifully written. This is definitely more on the literary side of things, but I found it such a compelling read. I couldn't put it down. I absolutely loved it. So as I said, Pine takes place in rural Scotland in the modern day, and we follow a girl who is living kind of a very sad life. Her mother had disappeared. She left the family years before, and her father is just kind of a wreck now. I think he's an alcoholic, and he is very sort of depressed, and she's basically kind of raising herself while living in this house with her father. They're not the most beloved people in the community because small town gossip and things like that. When you have a mother who disappears, they may not say such nice things about your father. So this book is really about her kind of growing up in this small town, but also missing her mother. But also she begins to see this woman. She doesn't recognize this woman. She's never seen this woman before. And when someone else has an interaction with her, they forget her immediately. They kind of fall under her spell and they forget her immediately. And she's the only person who remembers that this woman exists. So it has a little bit of kind of that supernatural element to it too, but it really stays very firmly grounded in reality despite that. I thought this was fabulous. This is such a good book. And while it doesn't necessarily fit in with my usual sort of fantasy reads, I do think that that supernatural element would have a lot of appeal for people who are looking for something a little bit more literary. Then I have the classic His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. This starts with Northern Lights, or The Golden Compass if you are in the States. This is a really, really wonderful children's book series. The first book is definitely the one that has those kind of wintry vibes, but I very strongly associate the whole series with kind of like December and Christmas time, because that is when I read these books, I think last year or the year before, for the very first time. I would highly recommend these on audiobook if you are someone who listens to audiobooks, because there is a fabulous full cast, and Philip Pullman sort of plays the part of the narrator, and they're really, really good. They're so charming, but they're also quite harrowing. This is not a cute story about a girl and her little animal companion having adventures. This is some really dark stuff. So in Northern Lights, we follow a girl named Lyra, and she lives in an alternate version of Oxford here in the UK. And in this particular version of our world, people's souls exist outside of their body, and they take on the form of various animals. So when you're a child, your demon can sort of shapeshift and become any different kind of animal. And when you sort of reach puberty, your demon settles into a particular particular form and doesn't change again. So Lyra and her demon are living on the grounds of is it Jordan College in Oxford, which is a fictional school in Oxford, and she ends up getting sort of wrapped up in this great adventure, and she ends up on the run. She's trying to find missing children who are being kidnapped from Oxford and from around the country. So this is such a fabulous, fabulous series. I think that the first book is definitely the best one. The second and third ones kind of go in a different direction, which I really enjoyed, but a lot of the charm of this series and a lot of the things that I personally associate with the series happen in the first book. So you have the armored polar bears, you have the Arctic, you have sort of the riverboats and the people who live on the riverboats and the canals, and it's just a really, really fabulous series. If you're a fan of children's fiction, then obviously you should read these books because these are definitely middle grade books, but also if you are an adult, I think you would get a lot out of these as well. Again, I read these only a couple of years ago and I absolutely loved them. They're really dark and really impactful and just really, really fabulously written. Another atmospheric wintry read is Snowswept by Stephanie Burgess, but really I would recommend this entire Harwood Spellbook series because it'll give you the warm fuzzies. It's such a lovely series of novellas and short stories. You've probably heard me talk about these a million times, but I'm here to talk about them again because the series has just concluded. And it's lovely. So basically in this world, women are considered the more sort of sensible of the sexes and are the politicians. And men are the more kind of emotional and flighty, so they are the ones who do magic. They're magicians. And while it sounds like that would have some kind of looser gender roles in the society, it is just as strict as Regency England is in our world. So this takes place in an alternate England in kind of a Regency-esque period, and we follow Cassandra Harwood, who is the very first female magician. She's totally bucking convention. She's this incredibly powerful magician, but something happens and we sort of get the story from there. So this isn't necessarily the story of how Cassandra had this thing happen to her and sort of the results as you would imagine it would be in a novel. All of that has happened in the past and is explained to us. This is just like snippets of her life, kind of setting up the school for magic for young women to the first of its kind, very controversial in this world. And it's kind of like snapshots of her life, as I say, and it's lovely. It's so good. So you can find the reading order online, but it goes Snowswept, which is the story of her sister-in-law and her brother getting together, and that's my favorite because it's so charming. And then we have Snowspelled, which is the first like full novella. We have Thornbound, which is the second slightly longer novella. We have Moontangled, which focuses on another couple, or just the best. It's a sapphic relationship in that one. They're kind of a side couple throughout the entire series and they get their own book. You can tell that's one of my favorite ones. And then we have Frost Gilded, which is the very last one, which is just a short story to kind of bring the series to its conclusion. These books are so lovely. They're super atmospheric, but they're also really cozy. The perfect thing to like cuddle down with some hot chocolate and some blankets and maybe a cat or two, and just either read or listen to because the audiobooks are fabulous. They're narrated by Emma Newman, who's one of my favorite authors, as well as one of my favorite audiobook narrators, and they're just great. I really love these and I would so highly recommend them. So now we're moving from atmospheric into kind of spooky historical fiction, which I feel fits the wintry season perfectly. There's nothing better than scaring the crap out of yourself with a really good book during the winter time. So I have a few recommendations here, and I would highly recommend picking these up in the winter season because they'll just be perfect. So the very first one that I have is actually an author's sort of backlist. This is Laura Purcell, who wrote The Silent Companions, The Corset, and Bone China. I personally didn't enjoy The Corset, so I would definitely recommend The Silent Companions and Bone China. So The Silent Companions follows a young woman who has just been widowed. She is pregnant and she is sort of journeying to her deceased husband's sort of crumbling country estate in order to see out her pregnancy and have their child. However, it seems that she's not the only one in this house. There are these very strange things that she finds called silent companions, which are very much a real thing. You can look them up, they're horrifying, that are essentially Victorian cardboard cutouts. They are these giant, like life-sized wooden sort of flat cutouts essentially, and they are hyper realistically painted, and something very sinister is going on with these things, and it's just so good. I really love this. This is definitely a book that falls into the category of, is she mad or is there something really going on here? We don't really know what's happening, and it's so good. So in Bone China, we follow a character named Hester who takes up a position as a nurse to the very elderly and infirm Miss Pinecroft in Cornwall. She lives in this sort of big house in Cornwall, and I believe she's partially paralyzed and she doesn't speak. And Hester's obviously fleeing something from her past, and we get kind of bits and pieces of what's going on there. But a lot of this book actually takes place in the past with Miss Pinecroft when she is kind of a preteen and teenager, I believe. So consumption has completely destroyed her family, and she and her father move into this house to try to find a cure for consumption. It gets real creepy real quick. It's pretty horrifying. There's some kind of medical horror, I believe, in this book, so just in case that's something you're not interested in. But I thought this was absolutely fabulous. I go back and forth between whether The Silent Companions or Bone China is my favorite of her books. Of course, she has a new book called The Shape of Darkness coming out in January, and I cannot wait to read that because it's going to be so good. She's so good at creating tension and atmosphere, and that question of, is there something supernatural going on here, or is our main character just going crazy? And they're so good. I would so highly recommend them. Next we have Letters from the Dead by Sam Hercombe. So this actually is a book I just finished a couple days ago, and it is just coming out at the end of November. So I wanted to include this on the list because I think it fits the bill perfectly for a creepy historical fiction book that has crime elements, because as I said, historical fiction, crime fiction, the perfect things to read in winter. Combine the two and it's just the best thing ever. So this is the second book in a series. I am actually planning on picking up the first book, which I believe is A Shadow in the Lens, which was his debut novel. But this book you can read standalone without having read the first one, which is what I did. And we follow a character named Thomas Bexley, and he is a Edwardian era detective, and something went horribly wrong in his last case in the first book, and he is haunted by what happened. So there's this sort of criminal going around London. They're calling him the Wraith of London, I believe, and he's basically kidnapping people from their houses and not leaving a single trace, except for one instance. And it turns out that the fingerprint that was left behind is Thomas Bexley's mentor's fingerprint, who's kind of this pioneer of forensic science, and he's shocked that his mentor would be involved, and he decides he's going to set about finding out what really happened. Now the catch here is that Thomas is actually being haunted by spirits of the dead. They are absolutely destroying his life. He sees these sort of horrifying specters everywhere he turns, and he has these kind of supernatural encounters, and because of this he is a absolutely devastated alcoholic. He has these huge gaps in his memories. He's incredibly skittish, and throughout the book he's kind of, he thinks maybe he is actually losing his mind and kind of losing his grip on reality. I would highly recommend this. It's quite morbid. It definitely leans pretty hard into these supernatural elements, which is something that I happen to really love, and it's also a really good crime story. Next up is one that doesn't really fit in terms of the atmosphere, but is a really great historical horror novel. This is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I love this book. I read it in June, I think, before it came out, and I just completely fell in love. I would love to read more sort of gothic-y kinds of books that take place outside of, say, the UK, where a lot of them tend to be set, and this is just the perfect thing. This is exactly what I wanted, and again, while it doesn't really fit in with kind of the wintry vibes of a lot of these books, I think it would be a great one to read in winter. This book takes place in the 1950s in Mexico, and we follow a young woman named Noemi who's kind of a socialite, and she does her socialite thing. She's attending parties, she's sort of being courted by men, she wears fabulous clothes, and one day her father calls her into his office and says that her cousin, her much beloved cousin, who's recently married and swept off to the countryside, has sent them a very strange letter. And it's very clear that her cousin is distressed, perhaps disturbed, very, very ill. And her father sends Noemi out to investigate what's going on, to make sure that the family name doesn't get dragged through the mud in any kind of way. So she goes off to this very imposing house with this very strange family that her cousin has married into. And it seems like her cousin has some kind of epilepsy or something like that. She's very, very ill, and she's drugged up most of the time, but when she can speak, she's saying horrifying things. There are things in the walls, she's being watched, she's acting very paranoid. So as she's trying to nurse her cousin while the family's kind of running defensive, she sort of begins to get to know this family and this house and the history there, and some real hardcore horror stuff begins to happen. While this is very much a historical fiction novel, I think it definitely qualifies more as horror. I would put it further into the horror genre because of some of the things that do come up in this book. But it is a really, really beautiful historical fiction book. It has a totally badass main character. I absolutely love her and her sense of fashion, and it's a really, really good story. This is the perfect thing, again, to curl up with and just scare the crap out of yourself during the winter time. And the very last book that I have to recommend is one that was actually on my spooky recommendations list because it really fits in with both sort of spooky season and winter. This is Dark Matter by Michelle Paver. So this book was recommended to me by a real life friend, and I'm so grateful because I don't know if I would have heard of it otherwise, but it is so, so, so good. I really struggled to put it down. I read it in 2 sittings and just absolutely devoured it. It's so good. So this takes place, I believe, in the 1930s, and it's basically set up as a diary of this young man who joins an expedition to the Arctic. So his job is basically to do weather readings, to bounce them back to London, kind of legitimize the expedition, because I believe this is kind of the period in time where rich young men were just kind of like going off and calling it an expedition. So it's him and I believe 3 other men, British men, and they go off. And they end up in the Arctic in this particular area, I think just outside of Norway, maybe. And when they arrive, it is sort of the period of perpetual sunlight, because in that part of the world, at certain times of the year, the sun doesn't really set, and everything is great until members of the expedition basically are picked off through injury or whatever. Eventually he is left by himself in this incredibly desolate and isolated place, and 24 hours of darkness are coming. And as he is kind of trying to sort of live his life and keep this expedition going on his own, it is very clear that there is something outside in the night with him, and it is so good. I really, really enjoyed this. I believe she has another book called Thin Air, which is basically the same book, but it's mountain climbing instead of the Arctic, which is totally cool. I plan to read that at some point, but if you fancy mountain climbing more, perhaps you could pick up Thin Air as well, because they're very, very similar books. But I would super, super highly recommend her because her writing is so good. And it's such a compulsive read. I legit could not put it down. So that is it for my wintry recommendations. I hope you found something that you might like to add to your TBR, and I would love to hear if you have any sort of wintry atmospheric recommendations to read in winter. I have a lot of catching up to do with a lot of these kind of subgenres, and I'm always looking out for sort of winter set books because those are just my absolute faves, so definitely shout them out in the comments below. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so go ahead and hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.